A few days ago, I got into a bit of a disagreement with someone about the existence of the left-right political scale, and they seem to be firmly of the belief that the left-right political scale is just this construct which is inherently divisive, doesn't really have much validity. It was significantly more broad than that, but it made me consider, okay, so what role does the left-right scale play? Is it better to have it than not to have it? Should we disregard it because it's inherently divisive and it's being used to label one side this, one side the other, and all that sort of stuff? And I decided that I would firmly defend the existence of the left-right scale, because obviously it's a spectrum, but there are things which firmly sit on one side or the other. And so what I found here was just a pretty generic Politics 101 left-right breakdown, and I'll be able to utilize this to better or more effectively get across to you the point that I'm trying to make. So as you can see here, we have the left versus right scale here, or spectrum, whatever you want to call it, and you get fundamental differences which most people would generally associate with either the left or right. And this is why I find it useful to have this left-right. Because we know that there are differences in ideology, even on the left and on the right, but it's easier to understand the difference when you know that something is more inherent or more related to a particular school of thought. It's easier to group a bunch of different ideologies together if you can just call it left or right. So, for example, socialism, collectivism, the belief in class division and protectionism, all these sorts of things. It's far easier to group that all up into leftist thought, and then it's far easier, on the other hand, to look at individualism, capitalism, class retention, free trade, and group that all up on the right, because there is such a variety in ideological thought on either side that rather than having to list off all of these various different things, which you may not even be able to put a specific ideological name to, it's easier to say left or right because you know it at least belongs in that category. But then the problem arises, what about those things which aren't necessarily left or right, or aren't explicitly in one category or the other? And when I say that, I'm looking at things like protectionism, because there's no doubt in our minds that Donald Trump is the leader of a right-wing political party and movement, and yet he would be regarded as a protectionist presently when it comes to things like tariffs and imports, as is listed here, the introduction of tariffs on imports to protect local industry. This is a protectionist policy, which, according to this, this little diagram for us, would represent a more left-wing type economic policy. Now, perhaps it is. Nonetheless, I would also attribute that with nationalism, which is, again, widely regarded as a right-wing political ideology. And so that's where the labeling left and right can get a little bit muddled. But in addition to that, there are political movements which will utilize, ideologies or elements of particular ideologies, or at least policies, which could align with either the left or right, and they could merge that all together to be something more of a centrist party, but is still firmly kind of in one camp or the other on a particular issue. And so you could look at a party like New Zealand First, for example. You would have to say that they're probably a smidge more on the protectionist side, if you were to compare them to the other so-called economic right-wing parties in New Zealand. On top of that, they are far less neoliberal than those other parties, and are far more balanced in that area, and so they're not traditionally right-leaning economically in that sense as well, while still undoubtedly being right-wing in the current political climate. So to break everything down a little bit more, looking at the left for starters, socialism is something which I don't really like to just call socialism, because it's ultimately coming from a Marxian point of view. It's all Marxian thought. And so when it comes to a lot of these things, whether or not the left wants to admit it or not, a lot of it is really just stemming from Marxist theory, and then they've kind of evolved it over the last kind of 100 years to create what we have today, which many, or the average person on the left, probably has no idea quite how Marxist they actually are. But socialism undoubtedly stemming from Marxist theory, which goes into the class division, the ideal that all people should be equal, no working class, no middle class, and that's meaning, the classless society. And with collectivism ultimately being the idea that the population works together for the common good, and that's just made easier by the removal of classes from having that classless society, because that removes the inherent bias that comes across, or the inherent prejudice even that comes across, as well as opportunities and differences in opportunities and wealth that comes across with having a class-based society. And so that therefore allows you to collectivize and work together on an even playing field for the so-called common good. And all of that, of course, is upheld by the division of wealth, the idea that all benefits from land development, developmental material goods produced are divided equally among the population to ensure no poverty. And so, of course, all of these things support each other in achieving that Marxist vision. And so you could look at either of these things on their own and be like, yep, that's left-wing thought, that's Marxian thought, that is undoubtedly belonging to people on the left. Moving on to the right, capitalism. Obviously, capitalism is synonymous with the right, heavily due to individualism, the belief and the idea that each person rises or falls on their own merits alone. I think the right, is most accurately described as liberty first, contrary to what leftists will believe on the matter. But that is what drives a lot of the ideology on the right, is we believe in liberty, and as a result, that comes with deregulation, that comes with free markets, that ultimately comes with individuals being able to make their own decisions, allowing for growth and reaping the benefits of that, even if in many cases you could argue it's exploiting or disregarding the rights of others in order to achieve that. But ultimately, the point being, the emphasis is on liberty, the ability to make your own decisions, or work harder than others, or work less than others, make certain decisions which ultimately benefit you more so than others. But also you may have very good intentions with all of that, and so whilst it may be, yes, benefiting you, you're doing significantly more to help others in the process. And that's obviously the flip side from the left, who believe that rather than you being an individual, you should collectivize for the greater good. So all of the work you should put in should benefit others just as much as it benefits you. And so that is obviously the biggest difference in why capitalism and socialism is so different. It's because capitalism incentivizes you to work harder for yourself and for those you care for the most, be that your family, your community, etc. Retention of wealth, and again, this is going into what I've just been discussing, rather than it being stripped away from you from the government, from the centralized and collective organizations and governing bodies, that you get to hold on to more of it, you get to make more of the decisions yourself, and ultimately that allows you to shape your life in a way that is rather unique to yourself, and allows you to make the difference in society that you desire, rather than allowing either elected or even unelected individuals make those decisions for you. Class retention. This is one that I'll probably find some contention on, but class retention, the idea that we should be a ruling class, or that there should be a ruling class that make the decisions and a working class who do the work. See, I don't think the average person on the right actually thinks this way. They don't believe in class retention. They just kind of accept that there is always going to be differences between people which form classes on their own, that there's just always going to be people who are wealthy, people who are less wealthy, and so on. So that, by default creates a class-based system, but I don't think anyone's actually there in the effort to retain it. But in the nature of how the system works, you're obviously going to have that. But I also don't believe that's a bad thing. I don't think having a class-based society is bad. However, there needs to be class mobility. But admittedly, this is one of the areas where the right is probably struggling right now, or at least the economic right is struggling right now, and that is the fact that we are struggling for class mobility at present. If you have a class-based society but limit the amount of class mobility, be that deliberately or unintentionally, you are going to create a lot of issues. You're going to create a lot of individuals who are not particularly happy with neoliberal or other kind of more right-leaning economic policy, and they're ultimately going to be more attracted to the more socialist worldview on the matter, because if you're not allowing them to move between the classes based on their own decisions and based on, the amount they're working, if you're going to restrict the amount of opportunities they have for wealth, growth and wealth, for investments and all that sort of thing, ultimately they're going to prefer there to not be any classes at all. And so that's why I think a lot of younger people are naturally leaning towards socialism in this day and age, even though, historically speaking, younger people have always tended to lean left. But when we talk about young people leaning left these days, you say younger people tend to be liberal. And I think that's another big problem, is liberalism itself today is far more left-leaning than it was 50 years ago. And that's because of the rise of the New Left and a bunch of other stuff. But the problem is, if younger people in particular, but if people in general are stuck working 40 plus hours a week on lower kind of incomes and aren't able to make investments, aren't able to build wealth, then they are going to be extremely frustrated with the capitalist system, and they're naturally going to lean towards a change, or they're going to desire a change. And that's a harsh reality, and that's why even myself, I'm not a neoliberal. I appreciate the need for deregulation in certain areas. I also believe wholeheartedly in capitalism and the importance that people should be able to retain their wealth, and so I'm not particularly keen on high taxes. But on the other hand, I also have a soft spot or a belief in social investment. Do I think our current public health and education systems are over-regulated, filled with ideologues who really don't have any business being there? Absolutely. But I'm also not of the train of thought where the government should just, release all of their authority over all of these different things. I don't think that the best way forward is to just excessively grow the privatization of everything. What I do believe in is devolution to local communities, but still in a government structure. I think there should be dramatic reform of local government so that rather than local government being an afterthought that everyone kind of doesn't talk about until 3 months out from the local elections, and then even then doesn't put much thought into, that it actually becomes equally valuable to us and of equal importance to us because of just how much of our life it impacts. Now, the reason I say that is because we need a degree of government input into many areas, just not to the extent nor at the centralized level of a national government. So that's kind of where I'm at with it. And I'm firmly on the right. So that says a lot about how the left and right scale can be useful, but not necessarily a black and white measure of things. But if I were to assess everything that I've said up to this point, and then ask myself the question again, is there a left and right scale in politics? I would say yes. It's more fair to utilize a left-right scale than it is to just get rid of it completely and try and refer to people as capitalists or neoliberals, or what even is the in-between between a neoliberal and a socialist these days, because I've never bloody heard of it. There is a very, very clear theme with leftist thought and right-wing thought. Leftist thought consists a lot of collectivism, and right-wing thought consists a lot of liberty. And so whether or not you want to call it left or right, socialist versus capitalist, collectivist versus individualist, ultimately the distinction is useful, and it allows us to more accurately establish where someone's train of thought is at. If you know someone's on the left, then you've probably got a general idea of how they perceive the world, because there is a lot of particular ways of thinking which is associated on that side, and the same can be said for those on the right.